When working with divs in page layout, there's several different ways to position divs
This video is brought to you by ObbyPie's Academy.
within the page. Now, this can get a little bit complicated, so you've got to practice this and make sure you understand the different methods. Now, naturally, if we don't do anything at all, the divs just stack one on top of the other. So here, for both divs, first and second, I've applied the styles with 500 pixels. So there's our width of 500 pixels, a padding of 10 pixels, which you can kind of see right here, a big blue 10 pixel solid border, and a margin of 10 pixels. And what happens is each div is laid out one on top of the other. These are block level elements, so this is how they're laid out, one on top of the other. Now we can change the positioning strategy of one or both of our divs like this. So let's set a rule that only applies to the first div. Now you can identify the first div visually because I've got first div and second div here within the div itself. Now watch what happens when I say on the first div, position absolute, which means we're going to use an absolute positioning system like this is a grid. And I'm going to set an absolute position of left 0 pixels and top 0 pixels. And let's refresh. And what happened? Isn't that weird? Well, because first of all, we positioned absolutely, we broke that one after another positioning that's typical on in HTML documents if we don't set another positioning strategy. This will make it a little clearer. Let me make one quick change here. Let's set the position to top 100 pixels, left 100 pixels. And I'm going to save and watch what happens to first div. So second div, because we've disrupted that positioning, slides up into the top left-hand corner. But first div now is 100 pixels away from the left and 100 pixels away from the top. We could then go and again use absolute positioning for the second div and position it accordingly. So absolute, and let's do left 100 pixels and top, let's do 600 pixels. So this will move it 600 pixels from the top. And there we get first div and second div. Let's reduce this maybe to 400 pixels so it's a little closer together. So this idea of absolute positioning is just that. We can position the elements anywhere we want using kind of this top left scheme. Now that's not the only way to position absolutely. See, notice now I moved this one to 0. This one doesn't move because it's still 400 pixels from the top. But let's say I wanted to do this a little differently. Let's say this instead of top, we do bottom 0 pixels and left 0 pixels. And let's refresh. So now the second div moves into the bottom right-hand corner. This is, of course, margin space you're looking at right here in the white. But now we've moved it to the left bottom, and it's going to stay there no matter what the size of the browser is. So we've essentially anchored it. We could anchor this one to the top left and the other to the top bottom, and now we get this. So this is absolute positioning. It's not going to move. It's based on the grid. Now the problem here is that this really only works if you're certain that the divs are going to be of a certain width and height. So that's absolute positioning. The next one we're going to look at is fixed positioning. Now, before we get into fixed positioning, I should say that absolute positioning is relative to the parent element. Here's what I mean by that. Let's take everything and let's put it in a div that I'm going to call container. And we'll close that div after all the content down here. All right, and let's take the container div and let's position it absolute, and let's position it left 50 pixels and top 50 pixels. So we're going to take it 50 pixels out from the center. Now watch what happens when I refresh. And did you notice here that everything shifted now over to accommodate the actual container div, which is left and top 50. So because we did that, now everything is relative to that container. If we change these to fixed, right, like this, which is one of the more common ways to do this, then it's relative to the browser window, and everything moves back where we had it before. So fixed means basically we're going to base these top and left on the browser window, where if we had absolute, we're basing it on a parent element like this container that we had before. I'm going to take that container out, because fixed will always do the positioning based on the browser window. All right, so that's not going to change anything. Now, the other one we have is relative. Relative is interesting. Let's change the position of the second one to relative, and let's see what happens. And notice now they're almost overlapping. And I'm going to move it, let's move it left 500. Oh, that's 5,000. And watch what we get. So now notice, if we don't account for the margin space, it's relative to the div that came before. So I think if we moved it to 560, should be perfect. Oh, we still have the margin space. Yeah. So, okay, so there we go. So we've moved it over here now, 560 pixels, but it's relative in its position to the first div, so to the previous div. Change it to 530, which will account for the margins, and we have a perfect match. So relative positioning means relative to whatever came before. So if we set now here, this is bottom 0. Let's set bottom to 100 on the relative div. So now you see we move up 100 pixels because the bottom is 100 pixels away from the bottom of the previous div. If we set this to top, and the important thing to note here is in relative, everything is relative to the div that came before. Boom, so now we're 100 pixels from the top of the previous div. So relative means you can position your elements relative to each other. So if we took out the left here and made them even on the left, and we set the top to 100, we know that they're going to be 100 from the top of the previous div. Let's look at one more example. So here we have position relative, top 100, left 0. Let's refresh. So now, and again, it's the margin space that's moving us over here, but we're 100 from the top of the first div. If we switch this to bottom, now we're 100 pixels from the bottom of the first div. So it's interesting when you use relative positioning because it depends on the position of the element that came before. So there's a lot of different strategies you can use for layout, and it seems complicated, but you do need to practice these. And we're going to show you my favorite strategy in the next video, which is a floating layout.